Name's Earl McKenna, an old fisherman with more stories than teeth. If you enjoy a good mystery from the deep, you ought to subscribe to the channel. Now, let me tell you about a time way up in the cold waters of Alaska when I learned that a loaded rifle is sometimes a useless thing to carry. It was late in the season when the sun gets lazy and the air carries a bite that promises a long, hard winter. I'd taken my boat, the Sea Witch, a vessel as stubborn and weathered as myself, up to a place the map-makers barely bothered with, a secluded cove tucked away behind a knot of jagged islands that the old-timers used to call the Silent Larder. They called it that for a reason. The salmon ran so thick in the river that fed the cove, you'd swear you could walk across their backs without getting your boots wet. It was a place of brutal, honest beauty. The mountains didn't just rise, they stabbed at a sky that was often the color of wet slate. The forests were so dense and dark, they looked like they'd swallowed the light and forgotten how to spit it back. I was there for the solitude, and a haul of fish would see me through the winter. The first few days, exactly I got. The only sounds were the cry of an eagle, the slap of water against the hull, and the contented groan of my own old bones as I worked the lines. It was perfect, too perfect. The first hint that something was amiss came not with a bang, but with a stillness. I was watching the shore from my deck, sipping a mug of coffee that was strong enough to dissolve a spoon. A great brown bear, sow with two cubs tumbling after her like furry afterthoughts, emerged from the tree line. She was a magnificent creature, the undisputed queen of this domain. She ambled down to the river's edge, where the salmon were fighting their way upstream in a silver torrent. Her cubs were yipping with excitement, ready for the feast. The mother, she stopped. She stood at the water's edge, her massive head low, her nose twitching. She wasn't looking at my boat. She wasn't sniffing for other bears. She was staring into the deep, dark channel of the river as it emptied into the cove. There was a hesitation in her, a tension in her shoulders that I'd never seen in a bear that wasn't facing a rival. She took a hesitant step into the shallows, then another. The water wasn't even up to her knees. She swiped a big flopping salmon onto the bank with a single expert motion, but she did it with a frantic haste. Then, instead of settling in for a meal, she nudged the fish toward her cubs and herded them back toward the forest, casting nervous backward glances at the water the entire time. It was like she'd just committed a theft, terrified of getting caught. I thought it peculiar, but I chalked it up a mother's caution. Maybe a big male was lurking nearby, and I just hadn't seen him. But the next day, the same thing happened. A younger male, lean and full of swagger, came down to the same spot. The river was a buffet laid out just for him. He paced the bank for the better part of an hour, a picture of hungry indecision. He'd dip a paw in, then snatch it back as if the water were boiling. He'd let out a low, frustrated huff, his breath pluming in the cold air. He'd stare into the depths, his ears flat against his skull. The confidence would just drain right out of him. He eventually gave up, disappearing back into the spruce trees with an empty belly. This didn't make a lick of sense. I've spent a lifetime watching wildlife. I know their habit. Hunger for a bear overrides almost everything. They'll risk a fight. They'll risk getting close to a man's camp. They'll risk a lot for a full stomach. But these bears, the top of the food chain in this wild place, were acting like there was a shark in a swimming pool. They were spooked, truly and deeply spooked, by the water itself. The unease started to creep into my own heart. The silence of the cove, which had once felt peaceful, now felt heavy, watchful. I found myself scanning the dark, placid surface of the water, my eyes searching for what? I didn't know. A log? A shadow? My mind was trying to put a shape to a feeling, and it was coming up empty. The water in that cove was deep and dark as ink. The mountains surrounding it cast long shadows, keeping most of it from the sun's direct touch. It looked cold, ancient, and secretive. My sonar showed it was far deeper than it had any right to be. dropping off into a kind of trench right in the middle of the cove. An old geological site, I figured, but now it felt like a hiding place. The turning point came on the 5th day. I saw him from a mile off, a true titan of his kind. He was the biggest grizzly I have ever laid eyes on, before or since. He wasn't just a bear. He was a walking mountain of muscle and shaggy dark fur. His head was the size of a boulder, and he moved with the slow, arrogant certainty of a creature that has never known fear. When he walked, the ground seemed to accept his weight with a sigh. He was the king, and he knew it. He paid my boat no mind at all, treating the sea witch as if it were just another gray rock on the shoreline. He lumbered down to the river, his purpose clear. He was going to fish, and nothing in God's green earth was going to stop him. I found myself holding my breath, my coffee forgotten in my hand. This, I thought, would be the test. If this magnificent beast was also afraid, then something was terribly wrong. He reached the riverbank, and unlike the others, he waded right in. The water swirled around his powerful leg. He stood there for a moment, a statue of primal power, surveying his kingdom. He lowered his great head to the water, perhaps to grab a passing fish in his jaws, and then he froze. It was the most unnatural stillness I've ever witnessed. Every ounce of his arrogance, every bit of his authority evaporated in an instant. The fur and the massive hump of his shoulders stood up straight. A low sound rumbled in his chest, but it wasn't a growl of aggression. I've heard plenty of those. This was different. This was the sound of pure, abject terror. His head came up, his eyes wide, and he stared down into the water directly in front of him. He wasn't looking at a fish. He was looking at something under the fish, something that had made him forget he was a 2,000-pound predator. He took a clumsy step back, then another. He stumbled, his massive body suddenly uncoordinated, like a drunk leaving a bar. He turned and crashed his way out of the river, scrambling up the bank with a speed that defied his size. He didn't stop until he hit the tree line, and even then he didn't look back at me or my boat. He was still looking at the water before vanishing into the shadows of the ancient forest. I stood there on the deck, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The king had been dethroned. The monster that every other creature on that land feared had just met a monster that terrified him, and it lived in the water. Cold dread, colder than any Alaskan wind, settled over me. I looked down from my deck into the inky blackness beneath my hull, and I finally understood. The real danger in the silent larder wasn't on the shore. It was waiting, silent and patient, in the deep. Right then, curiosity, they say, killed the cat. Well, it's nearly drowned more than a few fishermen, too. After watching that king of the wilderness bolt like a scared rabbit, my own fear took a back seat to a stubborn, nagging need to know why. I've spent 50 years on the water. I know its moods, creatures, tricks. I've seen rogue waves, pods of killer whales working in terrifying unison, and squid big enough to make a man question his place in the world. I had never seen raw, primal terror in an animal that had no natural predator. It was an equation that didn't balance, and my mind just couldn't let it go. So, the next morning, under a sky the color of a fresh bruise, I decided to go from being a fisherman to being an investigator. It was a fool's errand, and I knew it even then. The Sea Witch had a decent fish finder, a reliable piece of equipment that doubled as sonar and depth sounder. It had mapped 1,000 seabeds for me over the years, showing me the ledges the halibut hid and the canyons where big ones dreamed. I fired a generator. The little screen flickered to its green glow, a small comfort gloom of the cabin. I started a slow, methodical grid search of the cove, chugging along at a crawl, my eyes glued to the screen. The first few passes were normal enough. The cove's edges were shallow, sloping down into a deep central basin, just like I'd figured. The screen showed the usual scatter of fish, schools of them moving like living clouds. But as I got closer to the middle, the part of the cove where the river bled into it, the bottom just fell away. The numbers on the depth sounder started spinning like a slot machine. 300 feet, 500, 1,000. It was a trench, a deep, black wound in the earth's crust, right here in this quiet little backwater. It was unnatural. A cove this small, this sheltered, had no business being this deep. It was like finding a skyscraper's foundation in a backyard garden. Then the sonar started acting. A shape appeared on the screen. It wasn't a school of fish. They show up as a sort of grainy cloud. This was solid, a massive, solid return that filled the lower half of the display. It was bigger than a whale, bigger than my boat. It was the size of a submerged hill. I cut the engine, the sudden silence making the thumping of my own heart sound like a drum. I watched, my mouth dry. The shape moved. It was slow, ponderous, a movement so deliberate it seemed less like a living thing and more like a piece of the continent deciding to shift. It slid across the screen, a vast green shadow, and then, as it passed directly under me, the sonar screeched screen went static, just a blizzard of green snow. My electronics completely scrambled. I slapped the side of the machine out of instinct, like you'd thump an old television. After a long minute, the bottom was there again, the deep, empty trench. The shape was gone, vanished, as if it had never been there. I sat there in the silence, a cold sweat beading on my brow. My fisherman's brain tried to find an explanation, a glitch, a dense school of sleeper sharks balled on the bottom, a magnetic anomaly in the rock. But my gut, the part of an old sailor that you learn to trust above all else, told me a different story. It told me I had just sailed over the back of something that shouldn't exist. The days became a tense routine of fishing and watching. The nights, however, were when the real strangeness began. That's when I started to hear it. At first, I thought it was the hum of the boat's own system, the little groans and sighs an old steel hull made settled water. But this was different. It was a sound that you felt more than you heard. A low, resonant hum so deep it was on the edge of human hearing. It would start around midnight, a vibration that would travel up through the anchor chain, through the hull of the Sea Witch, and right into the bones in my... It made the coffee in my mug tremble. It wasn't the song of a whale. I know every one of those haunting melodies by heart. This was more mechanical, yet profoundly organic. It was a steady, rhythmic pulse, like some colossal heart beating in the abyss below me. Vroom, vroom. It was a sound of immense scale, of unimaginable size and power, sleeping fitfully in its dark bed. I'd stand on the deck in the freezing night, wrapped in my thickest coat, and just listen, staring down into the black water. The fear, a physical thing now, a cold knot in my stomach. The isolation of the cove was no longer a comfort. It was a cage. I was locked in with it. The physical evidence came a day later. I was pulling in a net, my hands raw from the cold, when I noticed something odd floating in the water. Salmon, a half dozen of them, big, beautiful kings, just bobbing on the surface. My first thought was that a bear had finally gotten brave, had a sloppy meal, and left scraps. I motored over and gaffed one of them, pulling it aboard. The moment it landed on the deck, I knew I was wrong. The fish wasn't torn up. It wasn't shredded by claws or teeth. It looked crushed. There was a single perfect hole punched straight through its side, about the size of a telephone pole. The edges of the wound weren't ragged. They were cauterized, almost blackened, as if by intense pressure or heat. The fish's entire body was distorted, its bones clearly shattered by a colossal squeezing force. I pulled the others aboard. They were all the same, not eaten, just destroyed. Was a message, a display of effortless power. This is what I can do. I tossed the ruined fish back into the water, my hands trembling. This wasn't a predator that killed for food. This was something that killed out of reflex, or maybe just from moving around, the way a man might crush an ant under his boot without even notice. That was when the fear of the bears finally transferred completely to me. I understood them now. Their terror was not just an instinct, it was a reasoned, intelligent response to the presence of something far older and far more powerful than they were. They were right to be afraid, and I, in my little metal shell floating on the surface, was infinitely more vulnerable than they were. The feeling of being watched became... I'd be in my cabin, trying to read a worn-out paperback, and the hairs on the back of my neck would stand up. I'd feel a pressure against the hull, a subtle shift in the water that wasn't from the tide or the wind. I started talking to myself just to break the oppressive silence. My own voice sounded small and thin, swallowed up by the immense quiet of the mountain. I thought about leaving. I should have pulled anchor right then and there and steamed out of that cursed place without looking back. But there was a problem. The sky to the west, out toward the open sea, was turning a dark, bruised purple. The barometer was dropping like a stone in a well. A big storm was rolling in, a real monster of a blow, and I was trapped. The silent larder was no longer a pantry. It was a prison, and I was locked inside with its warden. There's nothing like an Alaskan storm to remind a man he's just a guest on this planet, a fairly unwelcome one. The sky didn't just darken, it collapsed. The wind came first, a low moan that grew into a full-throated shriek, tearing through the tops of the ancient spruce trees. Then the rain, driven sideways, so cold and hard it felt like being shot with pellets. Even in the supposed shelter of the cove, the sea turned on itself. The water, once as smooth and black obsidian, was whipped into a churning gray chaos. The sea witch, bless her sturdy heart, was thrown about like a child's toy. She groaned and shuddered with every wave that crashed over her bow, the steel plates complaining under the strain. I was a prisoner in the cabin, bracing myself against the walls, listening to the symphony of destruction outside. The rhythmic, deep hum from the depths was gone, replaced by the roar of tempest. For a time, the storm was the only monster I had to worry about. The worst of it hit just after midnight. The wind was screaming with such fury that it felt like the world was being torn apart at the seams. I was wedged in my bunk, trying to keep from being thrown to the floor. It happened. It wasn't a wave. I know the feeling of a wave hitting the hull, the clean, brutal slap of water. This was different. This was slow, grinding, irresistible pressure against the port side. The entire boat heeled over, not with the quick lurch of a wave, but with the ponderous, heavy shove of something solid. An iceberg, I thought for a panicked second, but that made no sense. We were anchored. Then came the sound, a sound that will be etched into my memory until the day I die. It was the sound of something unimaginably vast and rough, scraping along the length of my boat. It was like hearing a mountain grinding against the hull, a deep, vibrating, rasping noise that made every bolt and rivet in the sea witch scream and protest. I could feel the texture of it through the soles of my boots, a rough, plated, like colossal scales or ancient stony bark. It went on and on, a slow, deliberate caress from a creature so immense that my 40-foot steel boat was nothing more than a curious pebble in its path. My blood ran cold. This wasn't an attack would have been quick, violent, and final. My boat would have been crushed like a tin can. This was inspection. It was curiosity. The thing in the deep, roused by the fury of the storm, had come up to investigate the little vibrating annoyance ceiling. The scraping stopped. For a long, terrifying moment, there was only the sound of, and then a single soft thump against the stern, right below the water, and violent. It felt like a gentle nudge, a tap from a curious finger the size of a locomotive. In that moment, I was more afraid than I have ever been. It was the chilling realization of my own insignificance. I was a mouse in a house, and the owner had just noticed I was there. I stayed frozen in my bunk for the rest of the night, listening to the storm rage, convinced that at any moment the hull would tear open, the icy black water would claim me. But it never happened. As dawn approached, the storm, as if exhausted by its own fury, began to recede. The wind died down to a weary sigh, and the rain softened to a drizzle. An eerie calm settled over the cove. The world was washed clean, the air crisp and smelling of rain and wet pine. I shakily made my way onto the deck. The water was a sheet of dark, smoked glass, the surface disturbed only by the gentle patter of the lingering rain. The mountains were wreathed in mist. Silence was absolute. It was a scene of profound peace. I felt no comfort. It was the quiet of a hunting ground after the kill. I scanned the water, my heart a trip hammer in my chest. Nothing, just the vast, empty stillness. I was about to turn away to start the engine and get the hell out of there when I saw it. A ripple, not from the wind. It was in the center of the cove, right over the deepest part of the trench. A slow, oily upwelling that broke the glassy surface. And then something emerged. It rose from the water without a sound, a smooth, deliberate. It wasn't a head, a fin, or a tail. It was a section of its back, a vast curving expanse of something that looked like black leather stretched over interlocked cities. Huge. The visible part alone, the size small whale, segmented, glistening, pale morning light. Water streamed off it in silence. It was living geology, a piece of the seabed that had decided to come up for air. But that wasn't what stopped my breath in my throat. As it rose a little higher, a part of it rolled slightly, and for one eternal second, I saw the eye. It was the size of dinner plate, a perfectly round, dark lens set in a field of wrinkled gray flesh. There was no white, no iris, just a bottomless black pupil that seemed to drink the light, and it was looking right at me. I was transfixed. I saw no malice in that eye, no hunger, no anger. What I saw was far more terrifying, a vast, ancient, and utterly indifferent intelligence. It was not the eye of a predator sizing up a meal. It was the eye of a god, briefly noticing an insect on its doorstep before forgetting it ever existed. It saw me. It registered my small, fragile existence, and it did not care. The silent verdict was passed. I was nothing, a fleeting speck of no consequence. Then, as silently as it appeared, it submerged. The great dark plates slipped back beneath the surface, creating a single, slow, majestic whirlpool that gently rocked my boat. Then it was gone. The water was glass once more. I didn't hesitate. I didn't think. I scrambled to the bow, my hands shaking so badly I could barely work the winch. The anchor chain came up with deafening clatter, shattering the sacred silence. I ran to the cabin, fired up the engine with a roar, and pushed the throttle as far as it would go. The Sea Witch surged forward, leaving a churning white wake in the black water. I didn't look back. I steered for the open sea, my eyes fixed on the gray horizon, and I did not once glance in my rearview mirror. I left the silent larder and its ancient warden behind, abandoning the nets of fish and a piece of my own sanity. I've spent many years since then trying to make sense of what I saw. I have no name for it, no explanation. All I know is that the great bears of Alaska, the kings of the land, were wise. They knew in their primal bones what I had to learn the hard way, that there are places in this world that do not belong to us. They are ruled by forces far older and greater than our comprehension. And the greatest wisdom a man can learn is not how to conquer the sea, but how to recognize the places where he is nothing more than a trespasser. The sea's greatest lesson is humility. It teaches us that there are mysteries far older and vaster than our understanding, and that the wisest man is not the one who conquers the unknown, but the one who knows when to respectfully leave it alone. Did you enjoy this story? My name is Earl McKenna, and I have a sea of tales. Subscribe to the channel, and you won't miss a single one.